Harriet Cole laid the Christmas table for 11 people. She never set a place for herself. 9 years running, the same. And she didn't mind the kitchen. She minded that not once in all those years had a single soul asked her why she wasn't sitting down. Then, one Christmas, over the goose, her sister-in-law said something kind. Said it in front of all 11 of them. "When your father's gone, Harriet, we'd see you comfortable in the back bedroom." And every head at that table nodded. There was a letter in her apron pocket, from a cousin in Canterbury. 4 months, unopened, unanswered, and the 10th Christmas, when the family came back from church, they found her room swept bare. The dairy money and the poultry money counted into 2 neat stacks on the kitchen table, the keys laid beside them, and a note. 1 sentence long. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before I tell you the rest, and I'm going to tell you all of it, do me one kindness. Subscribe to the channel and comment which county you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Fenn Marden farm sat in a fold of the Kent Weald, a few miles out from Maidstone. This was the 1880s. Sheep on the high ground, a little arable that never quite paid, and down in the wet corner a dairy that did. It was a coal farm and had been for 3 generations. The name meant something at market. People said it the way you say a thing you trust. Harriet was the eldest of the Cole children. She'd stayed home first to nurse her mother. Eliza Cole took to her bed one damp February and did not get up again for the better part of a year. Harriet sat with her, turned her, fed her broth from a spoon, and while she did it, she kept the house running, because the house did not stop needing to be run just because its mistress was dying. When Eliza passed, Harriet was 22. She meant to stay a season. Just till her father found his feet, she stayed the rest of her life instead, not by any decision. That's the thing you have to understand. Nobody ever decided it. She simply did the next thing, and the next, and the years closed over her head like water. Her father was Thomas Cole, a big, slow man gone gaunt with age. He wanted the farm to run the way it had always run. He'd walk the fields of a morning and come in for his dinner, and it would be there, hot, on the table. He never wondered how. To Thomas, the running of Fenn Marden was a kind of weather. It happened. You didn't ask the sky how it made rain. There were 2 brothers. Edward was the elder, and the farm would be his one day, the whole holding. Edward wanted respectability more than he wanted anything. He wanted to be the sort of man other men tipped their hats to. And he mistook the smoothness of his own life for the natural order of things. He thought the farm ran itself because he had never once seen the hand on the churn. Robert was the younger brother, easygoing, fond of his comfort. He wanted his share of the place and no trouble in the getting of it. Robert had a simple arithmetic in his head. Labour that cost no wage cost nothing. His sister worked and was not paid. Therefore, his sister's work was free. Therefore, it was worth nothing. He never said it out loud. He didn't have to. It sat behind everything he assumed. Both brothers had married. Edward's wife was Susan. Susan cared very much about where a person sat and in what order a person was served. She wanted precedence at the table, and she got it, and she thought that was the whole game. She could not tell the difference between running a house and living in one. She sat in the parlour and rang the little bell, and something happened in the kitchen, and to Susan those 2 things had no connection at all. Robert's wife was Charlotte, and here I want you to be careful, because Charlotte was not a cruel woman. Charlotte was genuinely kind. She'd bring Harriet a ribbon back from town. She'd say, "Sit down a minute, you look tired." She meant it, but her kindness was the kindness of the comfortable toward the poor. It was charity, and charity assumes the person you're being kind to has no claim on you, that they can't send you a bill. Remember that. It matters later. So that was the house. Thomas in his chair, growing frailer. Edward and Susan, Robert and Charlotte, a scatter of children, and Harriet, moving through all of it, keeping all of it turning, the way a shaft turns a mill. Now, the Christmas table. This is where the whole thing lives, so let me set it down plain. Every Christmas, the good cloth came out, the one Eliza had brought to her marriage, and the table was laid for the family, for the brothers, their wives, the children. Places set, glasses out, and Harriet ate in the kitchen. Off a plate, on the corner of the scrubbed deal table, with the goose fat still spitting in the pan behind her. Because someone had to see to the dinner. That was the reason given. The once or twice it needed a reason. Someone must see to the dinner, and it was true, in its way. Someone must. But you'll notice the someone was always the same someone. And you'll notice nobody ever offered to take a turn. And you'll notice, this is the cruel part, that it was never once discussed. Not properly. Because to discuss it would have made it a decision. And a decision can be questioned. A decision has an author who might be wrong, but a custom has no author. A custom is just how things are. So they let it be a custom, and that way no one had to own it. Harriet let it be a custom too. That was her blind spot, and I want to be fair to her because she paid for it. She believed that staying quiet was the same as being understood. She thought if she just kept doing the work, the worth of the work would be seen, that the seeing would happen on its own. It doesn't. It never does. Silence isn't a language. It's an empty room, and people will furnish it with whatever's cheapest for them to believe. Here's the thing that sat under the whole house, and nobody at that Christmas table ever thought about it. The accounts. The dairy account book. It had been in Harriet's hand since the winter her mother took to her bed. Every pound of butter that went to market, every cheese, every shilling that came back, Harriet wrote it down. She kept the tally. She knew to the penny what Fenn Marden earned and what it spent. And not one person at that table had ever wondered who kept that book. It just got kept. Like the rain, she loved them. I need you to hold both these things at once, because this is what makes the story hurt. She wasn't a bitter woman plotting in the dark. She loved her father. She loved her brothers, even Robert. She was fond of the children. That love is exactly what made the arithmetic so terrible when it finally came. Because the sum she'd eventually have to do was a sum about people she loved, and it came out wrong. It came out so wrong. Let me show you the work. Because you can't feel the ending until you've felt the labour. Start with the dairy. The arable at Fenn Marden barely cleared its own costs, some years not even that. The sheep did middling. But the dairy was the money. Harriet was up before light. In the cold months you'd see the one lamp burning in the dairy window while the rest of the house lay dark. She scalded the pans. She skimmed the cream. She set the milk. She turned the cheeses in the loft, every one of them, by hand, week on week till they were ready. And the butter she made was known. Buyers asked for the Fenn Marden butter by name. Do you want to know what that dairy brought in? £143 a year. I'm going to say that again, because in 1880s, Kent, that is not small money. £143. That was the cash the whole family's respectability floated on. Edward's good coat, Susan's precedence, Robert's ease, the children's boots. It all came, in the end, from Harriet's hands in the cold before dawn, turning cream into money. And no one saw it as hers. They saw it as the farm's, as though it welled up out of the ground. Now the market. Once a fortnight, Harriet went into Maidstone with the cart. And I want you to picture this scene, because outside that farmhouse, out in the wider world, the truth was already plain as day. The corn market, dealers, factors, farmers, the smell of grain and horse and pipe smoke. And in the middle of it, a corn factor named Amos Redgrave, a weathered man, sharp-eyed, who'd bought and sold in that market 30 years and knew everybody worth knowing. When Harriet came to his stall, Amos Redgrave took off his hat. "Miss Cole," he'd say, and he'd settle the corn account with her. Not with a note to be taken home to the men. With her, because she was the one who knew the figures. He'd run his thumb down her column and shake his head and say, "I'd sooner trust your reckoning than the bank's, Miss Cole. You've never once been out by a farthing." And the other dealers within earshot thought nothing of it. Of course you dealt with Miss Cole. Everybody dealt with Miss Cole. That was Fenn Marden. You understand what I'm telling you. The whole market knew who ran that farm. The only people who didn't know were the people who lived in it. Hold on to that. It comes back. Harriet kept a second money too, quite separate. The poultry. The hens were her own province, hers entirely. She fed them, she sorted the eggs, she took the fowls to market fat. And that money, the egg money, the poultry money, went into a tin. Not a great sum. £1 and £20 a year. Near enough. £21. But here's the thing about that tin. It was called her own. Her own little bit, and every penny of it, every single penny, went back into the house, into the children's things, into the small mendings, into the gaps the housekeeping money didn't stretch to cover. Her own money, and she spent it on them. They'd have been shocked to learn how much of what they enjoyed came out of Harriet's private tin. They never learned it. Why would they ask? And then there was the nursing, because Thomas's chest had begun to go. 3 winters running, the old man's chest filled up and rattled and frightened them all. And each time the doctor came out from Maidstone in his trap, and each time he gave his instructions to Harriet. Not to Edward, the heir, not to Robert, to Harriet. The poultices, the hours, the drops, how much and how often. When to prop him up and when to let him lie. The doctor knew, same as Redgrave knew. The competent man from outside took one look at that household and spoke to the one person in it who'd act on what he said. So add it up. I'm going to add it up the way Harriet herself would add it up one night, later, in the dairy, by lamplight. But feel it first, before the numbers. She was the dairymaid. She was the housekeeper. She was the nurse. She was the clerk who kept the books and the woman of business who dealt at market. 4 people's work, in one pair of hands, from dark to dark. And the word wages had never once been spoken in that house. Not as a joke. Not in passing. Never, you do not pay wages to the weather. Which brings me to the 9th Christmas. The one I opened with. I want to walk you into it slowly, because it's the hinge of the whole thing, even though at the time it looked like nothing at all. The table laid for 11. The good cloth. Candles, the goose brown and steaming, carried through from the kitchen by Harriet herself and set down before her father to carve. Her own place, as ever, not set. She'd eat after, in the warm kitchen, off her mother's willow pattern plate. The chipped one. She always used the chipped one. It had been Eliza's, and the small blue picture on it, the bridge, the 2 birds, the little figures crossing, had worn thin with washing. But Harriet liked it. It was the one thing at that whole feast that felt like hers. The family sat. They ate. The talk went round, easy and full, the way it does when people are warm and fed and have never once had to worry about who made the warmth. And then Charlotte, kind Charlotte, turned to Harriet, who was just then leaning in to clear a dish. And Charlotte said it. She said it gently. She said it the way you'd offer someone a shawl. "When your father's gone, Harriet, we'd see you comfortable in the back bedroom." And around the table the heads nodded. Susan nodded. Edward nodded. Robert nodded, chewing, it was settled then, a kindness. A promise even, when the old man died and Edward had the farm, they wouldn't turn Harriet out. No, they'd keep her. In the back bedroom, the little one over the scullery with the sloped ceiling and the one small window that looked at the wall of the barn. And Harriet stood there with the dish in her hands and understood something so completely and so quietly that not a muscle in her face moved. She understood that the back bedroom was not a threat. That would almost have been better. A threat means you're a force to be reckoned with. No, the back bedroom was their picture of her whole future. It was the entire sum of what they imagined she was owed. A corner. A bed. Kept, like an old dog that had been faithful, and the reason they could offer it so lightly, so warmly, without a flicker of shame, was this: they had never once had to work out what she was worth. There'd been no reckoning, so there was no debt in their minds, and with no debt, a bed in the back was generous. It was more than nothing, and to them she was owed nothing, so it was pure kindness. You see the trap she was in. Their kindness proved she had no claim. The nicer they were, the plainer it was that they thought she'd never send a bill. She looked at the 11 faces she loved, and she said, "That's kind. That's all. That's kind." And she took the dish through to the kitchen, and she saw to the pudding. Now, in her apron pocket, that whole Christmas, there was a letter. It had come 4 months before, in the late summer, from her cousin, Jane Ashby, over near Canterbury. Jane had a dairy business of her own, and it was thriving, and Jane wanted to grow it, and Jane had heard, because these things travel among dealers, Jane had heard what the Fenn Marden butter was, and whose hand made it, and whose reckoning the corn factors trusted over the banks. And Jane had made Harriet an offer, not a place, not a position, a partnership, a full partnership. Harriet's name on the board over the door, Ashby and Cole. On the strength, Jane wrote it plain, on the strength of Harriet's own reputation with the dealers, which was worth capital in itself. 4 months that letter had lain in Harriet's pocket, moving from apron to apron on wash day, the fold of it going soft. 4 months unanswered. Because to answer it was unthinkable. Who would keep the accounts? Who would set the milk before light? Who would read the doctor's face when her father's chest filled up? She was necessary, and being necessary had felt, for 9 years, like being loved. She'd got the two things confused. Most people who give their whole lives away make exactly that mistake. But the back bedroom sentence had knocked something loose. Not anger. I want to be careful here, because this story has no rage in it, and that's what makes it land. What the sentence knocked loose was arithmetic. There came a night, not long after that 9th Christmas, when Harriet sat alone in the dairy after the house was aibed. One lamp, the cold coming up off the flags, the pans scoured and stacked, and she took a stub of pencil and the back of an old bill, and for the first time in 9 years she did the sum. Her own sum. About herself. The dairy. £143 a year. The poultry, 1 and 20. That was money that came in, that she had made, and she wrote it down. Then she thought about what she'd have cost had she been a stranger hired. A dairymaid, a good one, wanted £16 a year and her board. She wrote 16. A housekeeper. A woman to nurse an ailing man through his bad winters. She could not put a clean figure to those, so she left them open. But she knew they were not small. And then she did the thing that changed everything. She multiplied. Not 1 year. 9. 9 years of dairy. 9 years of poultry money poured back into their comfort. 9 years of a wage never paid. She sat there with the numbers in her own hand, and she saw, laid out in pencil on the back of a bill, exactly what 9 years of Harriet Cole had come to, and it was a fortune, not a great house fortune, a working fortune. Enough to have set a woman up. Enough that the offer in her pocket was not a charity from a kind cousin, but a fair trade between 2 women of business, one of whom happened to be worth every penny of it. She looked at the number a long time. She did not cry. That's important. She'd have told you there was nothing to cry about. It was only arithmetic. It was only the truth, written down at last where she could see it. And then she understood the second thing, the thing the whole story turns on. Listen to this, because it's the coldest, clearest bit of thinking in the story, and it came out of the gentlest woman in it. She understood that she could not argue. If she went into the parlour and said her piece, if she laid it all out, the money, the years, the injustice of the back bedroom, what would happen? There'd be a scene. Susan would weep. Edward would go stiff and offended. Robert would say she was being unfair after all they'd done for her. And by Boxing Day, it would be smoothed over. It would become a thing that had happened. The Christmas Harriet got upset. A scene can be forgiven. A scene can be absorbed. A scene, in the end, changes nothing, because the day after, someone still has to see to the dinner, and it'll be her, because it's a custom, and she'll have proved she's difficult into the bargain. An argument, she saw, would be the safest thing in the world for them. It would let them off. But a swept room, a balanced ledger, a neat stack of coin and a set of keys and one plain sentence. That could not be argued with. There was no scene in it to forgive. There was nothing to smooth over. There was only an absence, and an absence speaks in a language that has no answer. You cannot talk a woman back out of a fact, so Harriet folded the bill with her sum on it and put it away, and she took out Jane Ashby's letter, 4 months soft in her pocket. And by that same one lamp, in the cold dairy, she answered it. She wrote that she accepted, that she would come, that she would bring what she was worth, which was, it turned out, considerable, and she named the day she'd arrive in Canterbury. She sealed it, and in the morning she carried it to the post herself, walking the frozen lane with the letter warm inside her coat, and she felt, she'd have been ashamed to say it, she felt lighter than she had in 9 years. The house noticed nothing. Why would it? The butter still came, the books were still kept, Thomas still had his hot dinner set before him like weather. Harriet moved through the last of it, that winter, doing every task as she'd always done it, and she did each one a little more carefully than usual, because she knew, in a way none of them could, that she was doing it for the last time. The last skimming, the last turning of the cheeses, the last time she'd read the doctor's face by her father's bed. And she made her plan. Not a grand plan, a quiet one. There was one day in the year when the whole family, the whole house, would be gone from it together, at the same hour, for a good stretch of time. Christmas morning. Church, even Thomas, if his chest was fair, was helped into the cart and taken into the service, and Harriet stayed behind, as she always did, because someone must see to the dinner. The 10th Christmas Eve came, and on the morning of it, when the bells started up across the valley and the family loaded into the cart in their good coats, Susan fussing the children's collars, Edward flicking the reins, Robert grumbling at the cold, Harriet stood in the kitchen doorway in her apron and watched them go. Charlotte turned and waved to her. "Shan't be long," she called, kind to the last. Harriet lifted her hand. The cart went down the lane, the sound of it faded into the frost, and the house was hers and empty, for the first and last time. She did not hurry. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She did not hurry, and she did not weep, and she did not falter. She went up to her room, the room she'd had since she was a girl, and she emptied it. It didn't take long. There wasn't much. She swept it out with her own broom till the boards were bare and clean, and she left it that way, not stripped in anger, but swept, made decent, the way you'd leave a room for the next person out of respect. That swept room would say more, later, than any letter could. She came down. She fetched the dairy money and counted it out onto the scrubbed kitchen table in one neat stack. Then the poultry money from her tin counted into a second stack beside it. Her own money, that, she could have taken it. It was hers by every right. She left it. Every penny. She would not have them able to say she'd taken so much as a shilling that could be quarrelled over. She took the account book and she made it up. Right to that evening. Every figure squared, every column true, so that whoever opened it next would find nothing owing and nothing hidden, would find in fact the plainest possible statement of exactly what had been kept, and by whom, for 9 long years. She laid the book open beside the coins. Then the keys, the whole ring of them. The dairy, the loft, the stores, the doors, she laid them down beside the money, and she wrote the note. She'd thought about it a long time, and in the end there was only one thing to write, because anything more would have been an argument, and she was done with arguments. She wrote it in her clear, market-trained hand on a half sheet of paper. The accounts are made up to tonight, and the keys are here. That was all. That was everything. She put on her coat, and from the dresser, from among all the good china that was the family's, she took one plate. Only one. Her mother's willow pattern plate. The chipped one, with the little blue bridge and the 2 birds and the figures forever crossing the water. She wrapped it in a cloth and put it under her arm. It was the only thing in that whole house she carried out the door, and it was the only thing in it that had ever truly been hers. She stood a moment in the kitchen. The 2 stacks of coin, the open book. The keys, the one plain sentence. Behind her, the fire she'd banked would burn down slow and go cold, and no one would think to build it up, because building it up was one of the 50 invisible things a day that were about to stop happening all at once. Then Harriet Cole walked out of Fenn Marden down the frozen lane to the crossroads where the Canterbury carrier's cart would pass at noon. The bells were still going. Her family was still in the pews, warm, singing, certain the world would be exactly as they'd left it when they came home hungry to their Christmas dinner. They were 3 hours from the truth, and they had no idea that the floor of their whole comfortable life had already, quietly, gone out from under them, laid out in coin and squared columns on a kitchen table. Under one lamp, waiting, they came home hungry and singing. The cart turned in at the gate a little after 3, with the light already going blue at the edges. Edward drove. Susan sat beside him with the youngest child asleep against her. Robert and Charlotte came behind on foot with the others, their breath white in the cold, their voices loud with the good feeling of a service well sat through and a dinner waiting. Thomas rode wrapped to the chin, dozing, glad to be near his own fire again. Nobody looked for smoke from the kitchen chimney. Why would they? The dinner saw to itself. The dinner always saw to itself. They came in stamping their boots and rubbing their hands. Susan called out for Harriet to take the little one and got no answer and thought nothing of it. The kitchen was cooler than it should have been. The fire had burned right down to a grey rose of ash, and no one noticed that either, not yet. Charlotte put the kettle on herself and laughed about it, because it was Christmas, and one did not mind a small thing on Christmas. "She's stepped over to Marsh's, I expect," Robert said, warming his back at the dying grate. "For the eggs, or some such." "On Christmas Day," said Susan. "She's always at some such." And that was the whole of it. She was always at some such. That was the shape she had in their minds. A woman forever stepping out to see to a thing, and forever stepping back in with it seen to. So they hung their coats and lit the good lamps, and the children ran wild through the house, and no one built the fire up. Because building the fire up was one of the 50 invisible things, and the person who did the 50 invisible things was walking a frozen road toward Canterbury with a plate under her arm. The dinner did not appear. By 5 they had begun to feel it, without naming it. The goose was in the larder, cold, uncooked. The pudding sat unlit. Susan went into the pantry and came out with her mouth set, and said the girl might at least have put the bird down to roast before she went gadding, and Charlotte said perhaps she'd been taken ill somewhere, and Edward said, with the first thread of temper in his voice, that a grown woman did not simply vanish on Christmas Day. They ate late, and poorly, and cross, bread and cold ham and pickle, standing up, the children fretful. Edward carved the ham himself, and did it badly. Susan burned her hand on a pan she was not used to lifting. Somebody had to draw the water and bank the range and see the little ones to bed, and it fell in fits and starts to whoever was nearest, and it was done clumsily and late and with a great deal of complaint. And still not one of them went up to Harriet's room. Why would they? A closed door at the top of the back stair was the most ordinary thing in that house. It had been closed 9 years. It was Christmas morning before Susan found it. She had gone up early, meaning to be sharp with Harriet, meaning to have it out about the ruined dinner and the shame of it before the others were down. She went along the landing and knocked at the narrow door and got nothing. She knocked again and said the girl's name low and hard. Nothing, so she lifted the latch and pushed it open, ready with her first cold sentence. The room stopped it in her throat. It was bare, not untidy, not slept in and left, bare, the bed stripped to the ticking and the blankets folded square at its foot, the little washstand wiped clean, no brush, no comb, no shawl on the peg, no shoes beneath the bed. The window had been opened to air it and shut again. The floor was swept. It was the room of a person who was not coming back, and Susan had kept house long enough, even a house she did not run, to know the difference between a room left and a room given up. She stood a moment. Then she went down the back stair faster than she had gone up it. They gathered in the kitchen in their night things, one by one, drawn by the note in her voice. And there on the scrubbed deal table under the cold lamp was the thing Harriet had left for them to find. 2 stacks of coin, neat as churches, one the dairy money, one the poultry money, each counted and squared and set down without a word of covering. The account book beside them, open, made up in that clear market hand to the last evening she had spent under the roof, every column ruled off, every total carried, nothing left ragged for another to puzzle at. The whole ring of keys laid alongside, dairy, loft, stores, doors, and a half-sheet of paper. Edward picked it up, he read it, and his face did a thing his face was not used to doing. Then he read it aloud, because he could not seem to believe it would say the same thing twice. The accounts are made up to tonight, and the keys are here. H. That was all. That was everything. For a moment, no one spoke. The children, sensing it, went quiet in the doorway. Robert looked at the coin, and at the keys, and at the book, and back at the coin, as though the arrangement of it were a puzzle that would come clear if he stared long enough. Charlotte had gone very white. Susan said, in a small flat voice, "She's gone." And Edward, who liked respectability and no fuss, felt the first cold drought of a truth that would take him a fortnight to feel the whole of, that the smoothness of his life, the thing he had taken for the natural running of a well-run farm, had a name, and the name had just walked out the door and left its keys on the table. They did not, even then, understand it. They thought it a temper, a slight, a thing that would be mended by 12th night with a firm letter and a little coaxing. They did not yet know they were looking at a ledger, and that a ledger cannot be coaxed. The knowing came the slow way. It came through the milk. The first week she was gone, the dairy failed. It did not fail all at once, with a crash. It failed the way a thing fails when the one hand that understood it is lifted away. Susan went out to the dairy on the second morning, because someone must, and found it a cold, clean mystery, the wide, shallow pans, the crocks, the presses, the muslins, the churn standing like a patient beast in the corner. She had drunk milk all her life and never once made a pound of butter. She knew, vaguely, that you turned the handle. She did not know for how long, nor how cool the room must be kept, nor that the cream must be ripened just so and not a day past, nor 100 other things that Harriet had known in her hands without ever being told. The milk would not set. What cream she skimmed, she churned too warm, and it came at last to a soft, greasy curd that was not butter and would never be butter, and she wept over the churn in a way she would have been ashamed for the others to see. The next batch turned before she got to it. It went sour in the pan and had to be thrown to the pigs, and the pigs were the only creatures on Fenn Marden that Christmas week that ate as well as they were used to. A whole churn spoiled uncounted. That was the phrase Robert used later, without understanding what he was saying, uncounted, because that was the other thing that had gone. Not just the making of the butter, but the reckoning of it. How much went to market, how much it fetched, when Redgrave settled, what was owed and what was owing. It had all lived in one head and one book, and the book was made up to the 10th Christmas Eve and not one line further, and the head was in Canterbury. The hens felt it too. Harriet had fed them before light every morning of her life there, and gathered the eggs, and knew each bird's way. Now they went unfed till someone remembered them mid-morning, hungry and querulous, and within the week they had done the thing hens do when their world goes wrong. They stopped laying. The egg money, the £1 a year that had bought the small comforts nobody ever thought about, the tea and the sugar and the children's boots, simply stopped, the way a spring stops when you trample its source. And Thomas worsened. That was the cruelest of the small collapses, and the quietest. His chest had been bad 3 winters running, and through all of them Harriet had nursed him, knew the doctor's orders by heart, knew when to raise him and when to let him lie, knew the hour of each dose without a clock, knew the sound of his breathing that meant send for help, and the sound that meant only sit with him. The doctor, all those winters, had given his instructions to her, not to the sons. The sons had never thought to wonder why. Now the doctor came and gave his instructions to Edward, and Edward wrote them down and lost the paper, and the doses came late or came twice, and the old man fretted and could not say what was wrong, only that it was wrong, that the room was wrong, that the hands on him were not the hands he knew. He asked for the girl. In his confusion he asked for her often. And nobody had the heart, or the words, to tell him. By the end of the first month they had stopped calling it a temper. By the second month they tried to hire, and that was when the arithmetic began, at last, to speak to them in a language they could not pretend not to hear. Because you cannot hire a Harriet, you can only hire the pieces of her, one paid stranger at a time. Edward put it about that they wanted a dairymaid. A good one came out from near Maidstone and looked over the cold dairy and named her price without blinking. £16 a year, she said, and her board, and a half-day of a Sunday. £16 a year. Edward heard the figure, and something turned over in him, because £16 a year was a real sum, a sum with weight, and it was only the dairy, only the butter, only one of the things. Then they needed a woman to nurse Thomas, for the dairymaid would not, and that was another wage and her keep. And they needed someone to keep the house, the cooking, the washing, the mending, the marketing, the 50 invisible things, for the dairymaid would not do that either, and Susan, who had learned the difference by now between occupying a house and running one, could not. 3 paid strangers, 3 wages, 3 lots of board, 3 sets of hands where there had been one, and one only, and that one unpaid. They sat about the kitchen table one evening in February and did the sum. And it would not come out. The dairy income had stopped at the source, because there was no butter to sell, the egg money had stopped, and against that empty column they were setting 3 wages they had never dreamed of paying. Robert, who all his life had assumed that labour which cost no wage cost nothing, sat with the figures in front of him and could not make them balance, and understood. Dimly, and for the first time, that he had been living for 9 years on money that was never money because it was never paid, his sister's wage, banked in silence, spent by all of them without a thought. We'd have had her in the back bedroom, he said, half to himself. For nothing. Nobody answered him. There was nothing to answer, and then came market day, and Maidstone, and the thing that turned the private ruin into a public one. The corn account had to be settled, and the milk contract steadied, or it would lapse, and it was a thing that had always simply happened, on the same day each month, in the same quiet way, at a stall in the corn market, where a man in a good hat kept 30 years of the town's business in his head and his book. Edward had never done it. Robert had never done it. They went together, the two of them in their Sunday coats, feeling like boys sent on a man's errand, and that feeling was the truest thing they had felt in weeks. The market was loud and cold and full of men who all seemed to know one another. The brothers found the stall. Behind it stood Amos Redgrave, corn factor, 30 years in that market, a wide, unhurried man who had settled Fenn Marden's account every month for as long as either of them could remember, though neither had ever stood across the boards from him to do it. Edward laid down the account book. "We've come to settle the corn," he said, "and to see about the milk. On behalf of Fenn Marden." Redgrave looked at the book. He looked at Edward and at Robert and back at the book, and he was in no hurry at all. He opened the ledger and turned it round with one broad finger and studied the figures, and the figures did not match, because no one had made them up. There was a lapse in the milk contract because no one had renewed it. There were sums half carried and columns left ragged, the work of frightened men who did not know the trade. The other dealers were near enough to hear. That was the thing. The whole loud world of the market went a little quieter around that stall, the way a room does when something is about to be said that people will remember. Redgrave took his time. Then he said the hardest line in the whole of it, and he said it plainly, without heat. As a man states a fact, he is surprised to have to state. 9 years I've dealt with Miss Cole across this stall, gentlemen. He tapped the ledger once. Whole market knew who ran Fenn Marden. He looked from one brother to the other. I don't rightly know who I'm dealing with now. And there it was, laid out in the open air in front of the town. Everyone outside the family had always known. Every dealer at that market, every man who had watched the corn factor tip his hat to Miss Cole and settle with her and joke that he'd sooner trust her figures than the banks, they had all known, for 9 years, the thing the family had never once troubled to learn. That the farm was a woman, that the respectability, the smoothness, the good name at market had a single source. And it wore an apron, and it ate its supper in the kitchen off a chipped plate. Robert went red, Edward went white. Neither of them found a word to say to Amos Redgrave, because there was no word. You cannot argue with a man who is only telling you what your whole town has quietly known while you did not. They settled what they could, badly, and lost the better half of the milk contract because there was no one Redgrave could trust to fulfill it, and they drove home in a silence that was worse than any quarrel. It was on that road home that each of them, in their own way, at last did the sum. Edward did it first, and could not make it come out. He had thought respectability was the natural state of a well-kept farm, a thing that simply was, the way the fields simply were. Now he understood it had been made every day by one pair of hands, and paid for by no one, and he sat with the reins loose and tried to reckon what 9 years of that came to, and the figure kept climbing past anything he was willing to have owed. He had inherited the holding. He saw now he had inherited only the ground. The thing that made the ground pay had left on the 10th Christmas Eve and taken itself to Canterbury, and it was not coming back for a firm letter and a little coaxing. Robert, beside him, held the 3 wage bills in his mind, the dairymaid's £16, the nurses, the housekeepers, and against them the great empty nothing they had always paid his sister, and he arrived, by that ugly road, at the first honest valuation of her he had ever made in his life. She was worth more than he could afford. That was the plain truth of it. The woman he would have housed in the back bedroom for nothing, out of kindness, out of charity, was worth more in open wages than the farm could now find, and the only reason he had never known it was that she had never once made him find it out. Susan learned it another way. She kept the house now, or tried to, and she had wanted all those years precedence at the table to sit above this sister or below that one, to have her place set right. And she understood at last that the table had been the very least of it, that a woman who sits at a table and a woman who makes the table possible are not doing the same thing at all, and that she had spent 9 years mistaking the one for the other, and that she could no more run this house than fly. And Charlotte, the kind one, who had meant nothing but comfort when she said it, Charlotte sat by Thomas's fire one evening and understood the thing she had done. She had offered the back bedroom out of the goodness of her heart. She had thought it a gift. She saw now that a gift is what you give to a person who has no claim, and that Harriet had every claim, 9 years of it, squared and ruled and left on the table, and that in offering her charity Charlotte had told her, without ever meaning to, that her labour was worth nothing you could be made to pay. She had offered her a corner. Harriet had answered by naming her price the only way that could not be argued with, by leaving and letting the empty dairy do the reckoning. None of them said these things aloud. That was the shape of it to the end. There was no scene, no confrontation, no reckoning across a table with raised voices. Harriet was 100 miles gone. She never sent a second word. The one sentence on the half-sheet was the only word she ever gave them, and it did every bit of the work. And Thomas, in his chair by the fire, with the strange hands tending him and the doses coming wrong, asked after the girl. "Where's Harriet got to?" He would say, in the afternoons, when the light was low, "Tell her to bring my tea the way she does." And they would look at one another over the old man's head, and no one could find the way to tell him that the girl who had nursed him through 3 winters was not coming, and that the reason she was not coming was them. 6 months on, Fenn Marden was a quieter, poorer place. There were 3 hired women in the yard now, where there had been a daughter. The dairy ran again, after a fashion, the maid was good, and the butter set, but the income was thinner than it had been, because there was no one to carry it to market with the old authority, no one Redgrave tipped his hat to, no one whose figures the dealers trusted over the banks. The name Fenn Marden had lost a little of its weight, and weight, in a market, is money. Edward sat over the account book most evenings and could not make it balance the way it used to balance. The columns defeated him. He had the book, and the keys, and the ground, and the name, and still it would not come out right, because the thing that had made it come out right was never in the book at all. It was in the hand that kept it. The back bedroom stood empty. Nobody used it. Nobody could quite say why. And one grey evening Robert stood in the kitchen, looking at that scrubbed deal table where the 2 stacks of coin had sat, and he said the truest thing he ever said, quietly, not looking at anyone. "We never did decide what she was worth. Charlotte was by the range. She did not turn round. She said, 'No,' and then, after a moment, she did. That same morning, 100 miles off in Canterbury, the sun came up on a small neat yard behind a dairy, and on a sign, newly painted, over the door. It read, Ashby A.N.D. Cole, Dairy, Cole, her own name, on the board in fresh green letters, on the strength of 9 years of a reputation the market had made for her, while her family never looked. Jane Ashby had offered a full partnership, not out of charity but out of good sense, a fair trade for a name the dealers already trusted, and Harriet had answered the 4-month letter at last, and named her day, and come. Inside, at a table by the window, Harriet Cole sat over her own accounts. Her book, her columns, her hand. She ruled a line and carried a total, and the total was her own, and beside her elbow the tea went cool the way it did when the figures were good and she forgot it. The dealers had begun to send their greetings up the road. Redgrave among them, a word passed along by a carrier that the corn factor at Maidstone sent his respects to Miss Cole, and hoped Ashby and Cole did well, and had said to anyone who'd listen that Canterbury had got the better end of that bargain. It travelled the 30 years of his goodwill, that greeting, and it reached her, and she smiled at it and said nothing, and went back to her book. And on the dresser above her, where she could see it from her chair, stood her mother's willow pattern plate. The chipped one, the little blue bridge, the 2 birds, the 2 figures forever crossing the water. It had been Eliza's, and it was the one thing Harriet carried out of Fenn Marden. and now it stood in her own house, over her own table, in the morning light, the only thing in that whole other life that had ever truly been hers. And it was hers still. They never had to decide what she was worth. That is the whole of it, in the end. For 9 years they never had to, because she never made them. She kept the house, and the dairy, and the accounts, and the sick old man. And she ate her supper in the kitchen, off the chipped plate, and she stayed silent, and she believed this was her one blind spot, the thing she was slowest to learn, that staying silent was the same as being understood. It was not. Silence is only ever read as agreement. A person who never charges is priced at nothing, not because they are worth nothing, but because no one has been made to look. So on the 10th Christmas she stopped explaining. She left the arithmetic on the table under one cold lamp, the coin, the keys, the balanced book, the single plain sentence, and she let it do the deciding, and it decided in a fortnight what 9 years of Christmas dinners never had. It said, in the only language they could finally hear, exactly what she had been worth all along. She never set herself a place at that table. In the end she did better. She built her own, and set it, and sat down. If you were ever the one who stayed, the one who kept the whole thing running while nobody thought to ask why, tell me the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels.